So you've been given an assignment to write a literary analysis paper, or maybe you've been given a close reading assignment where you need to analyze a piece of literature. Well, today's lesson is just for you because we're going to look at how to critically analyze literature. This lesson is a little bit longer than the lessons I usually present on my channel, but it's a much more in-depth topic. It's a topic for high schoolers or even college students taking their first literature classes. As you view this lesson, you may very well want to take notes, and if there's anything that comes to mind that you wonder about further, please make a comment in the section below the video and I'll respond back to you. Now, I know some of these topics are kind of glossed over because it's sort of an introductory lesson. When I taught this lesson to my 8th grade advanced accelerated students who were really studying 9th and 10th grade content, we had already learned about each one of these components that go into critically analyzing literature before we put it all together to do a complete analysis. But whatever your need is, I hope you'll stick around to the end of the PowerPoint. We'll kind of bring it all back together because I want you to never stop learning. So today we're looking at how to critically analyze literature, dig deeper through close reading of text. So what is critical analysis? Well, analysis is basically taking something apart in order to understand it better by considering its component parts separately as well as together. Looking at all the different parts of something and considering those parts all individually. Now, the definition of critical, as is being used in critically analyzing literature, is expressing or involving an analysis of the merits and faults of a work of literature, music, or art. Synonyms for this word include evaluative, analytical, interpretive, expository, explanatory. Notice it's not critical as in, I'm very critical of you, like I'm trying to find out what's wrong with you. Critical analysis of literature is not looking for what's wrong with the piece of literature. It's just looking closely at each different aspect of it. So considering those definitions, a critical analysis explains a work of fiction, poetry, or drama. That's the meaning of the kind of literature we're looking at when we're critically analyzing literature. By means of interpretations, the goal of a literary analysis, which is a paper you might have to write or a talk you might have to give, is to broaden and deepen your understanding of that work of literature. Not just to find out what's wrong with it or what's right with it, but what are all the different aspects that can be considered about any piece of literature and how does that apply to the particular piece of literature that you're looking at. So we're going to consider each of these components separately, but basically when you're critically analyzing a piece of literature, you are examining its structure, the archetypes, any figurative language that occurs and reoccurs throughout the piece, the tone, the diction of the author, any symbolism that there might be, and influences on the author in his or her writing of the piece to begin with. Now, structure includes these three elements: point of view, organization of the text as a whole, and the elements of plot. A story can be told from multiple points of view, and we see this quite often in one chapter is told by one character, the next chapter is told by another character. That's multiple points of view. A story can also be told in first person. That's where the narrator goes ahead and includes himself in the story. It might even be a character in the story. He uses words like I, or we, or us, or me when he is narrating the story. A story could also be told in second-person point of view, and that's where the author is speaking directly to the reader saying, "You must understand this." Or a story could be told in third-person narration. This is where the narrator is probably not a character in the story, but is just like an overarching narrator. An omniscient narrator knows all the thoughts of all the characters. A limited narrator either doesn't know any of the thoughts of any of the characters. This limited narrator is just reporting on what is said and what is done. Or it could be a limited narrator who knows the thoughts maybe of the main character, but not of any of the other characters. There are different ways that plots are organized. Some plots are linear. They're chronological. They start at one place and they end at another place in the future from where it started. There are also non-linear plot structures where you might have flashbacks or you might have glimpses into the future. It's told in a non-linear way, not chronological. You also have circular plots. That's basically where the story ends up at the same place that it started. And you can also read stories with parallel plots. That's where there's two main plots basically happening at the same time. Sometimes those plots interact with each other. Sometimes they're just parallel plots, two stories happening at the same time, and there's really not a lot of interaction between the two plots. So a linear plot would start with the exposition, go on to rising action, have a climax, falling action, and a resolution. The series of events that happen are in chronological order. On the other hand, a non-linear story, even though it has characters and events just like a linear plot would have, a non-linear story jumps around. Maybe it doesn't start at the beginning. Maybe it starts somewhere in the middle or near the end of the story. And flashbacks are used to fill the reader in on the rest of the story. I think particularly of the story Holes by Louis Sachar. The Stanley Yelnats story is in the present, but it's constantly going back in the past and telling the history of how the holes got there in the first place. Now, the hero's journey is an example of a circular plot, and you can just look around the circle here. The hero starts with his call to adventure, their supernatural aid, and so on, transformation, atonement, then the return, and then we're back to the hero at square one. He's probably changed, but he's ready perhaps for another call to adventure. My favorite example of parallel plots comes from Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream. There's one plot line that runs for the royalty, Theseus, Lysander, Hermia, Demetrius, Helena, Hippolyta, and Aegeus. And then there's another plot line that's running with the fairies and with the players who actually put on the acting troupe. So these plots are all happening simultaneously, but the characters don't always interact with each other. Sometimes they do, but each of these groups of people has their own plot line, their own rising action, their own climax, and their own resolution. But it's all happening in one story. And those elements of plot. The exposition of a story is where the reader learns about the characters and finds out about the setting for the story. The rising action begins with the inciting force, that very first glimpse of the conflict, and the conflict develops until some sort of crisis occurs. There may even be more than one crisis that occurs before the climax of the story. Then there's the falling action and the resolution. Realize that the shorter the story, such as a short story or a novella, the shorter the falling action. A short story may have the crisis, falling action, and resolution occurring even in the same paragraph, the last paragraph of the story. But in a novel, a longer piece, the climax may occur 2/3 of the way through the story, leaving the last third of the story or so for the falling action and the resolution. You'll often see a plot depicted on this type of a graphic organizer. Okay, so we've looked at structure. Let's take a look at archetypes. It's often helpful to look at the etymology of a word in order to help understand it, and archetypes is not a word we see every day. The term archetype has its origins in ancient Greek. The root words archein, which means original or old, and typos, which means pattern, model, or type. Combined meaning is original pattern, of which all similar persons, objects, concepts are derived, copied, modeled, or emulated. Archetypes. Most main characters in stories can be associated with particular character archetypes. There are many more than what you see here, but let's just say, thinking back to our slide about the hero's journey, that our character is a hero, an archetype. He would have characteristics that other heroes have. So in critical analysis, two things that we've already talked about that can be analyzed in a piece of literature are its structure and archetypes included in that story. Now let's take a look at figurative language and how we can use that to help us critically analyze literature. Use of figurative language is something that definitely needs to be analyzed in a piece of literature. Figurative language uses the figures of speech to be more effective, more persuasive, and more impactful, to touch the reader in ways that just literal language cannot do. Figures of speech include metaphors, similes, and allusions. They go beyond the literal meanings of the words and they give the readers new insights. A simile makes a direct comparison showing similarities between two different things. It uses the words like or as. Here's an example. He sings like a bird. His singing sounds like a bird singing. Her hands were cold as ice. Her hands are cold, ice is cold. Direct comparison. Metaphors and similes are often mixed up, but once you learn the trick of telling the difference, you'll be able to figure it out. A metaphor makes an implicit, implied, or hidden comparison between two things that are unrelated, but which share some common characteristic. In other words, sort of a resemblance between two very different objects based on just one single common characteristics. He drowned in a sea of grief. This is our example here. He's drowning in this grief that seems to surround him like the sea. Here's another example. The flashlight cut through the curtain of darkness. Well, there's not really a curtain of darkness out there, but the darkness is so dark, it's like there's a curtain up in front of this person with the flashlight who has to use the flashlight as some sort of saber to slash his way through the curtain. Personification is another often used type of figurative language. In personification, an idea or an animal is given human attributes. The non-human objects are shown in such a way that we feel they have the ability to act like humans. For example, we might say the sky weeps when it rains instead of tears falling from the sky, though of course it's actually raindrops. So we say that the sky has been personified. Okay, so we've looked at structure, archetypes, and figurative language. Let's move on to tone. The means of creating or conveying an attitude by means of the author's diction, that is, the author's word choices, and telling the story is referred to as tone. By looking carefully at the choices an author makes in characters, incident, setting, the work's stylistic choices in diction, etc., imagery, formal or informal language, use of dialogue, sentence structure, careful readers often can isolate the tone of a work and infer from it the underlying attitudes that control and color the story or poem as a whole. Imagery is often used to set the tone in a piece of literature. I think it's easiest to understand tone by looking at examples. Here's an example from the short story The Black Cat by Edgar Allan Poe. The quote is this: "From my infancy, I was noted for all the docility and humanity of my disposition. My tenderness of heart was even so conspicuous as to make me the jest of my companions. I was especially fond of animals and was indulged by my parents with a great variety of pets. With these I spent most of my time and never was so happy as when feeding and caressing them." Now, if you take a look at the words I've highlighted, you can see that all of these words together sets a gentle, nostalgic tone for the beginning of the story. And of course, if you've read the story, you know the tone changes quite often throughout the rest of the narrative. Yep, so that tone does change. Here's another quote from the very same story. "I grew day by day more moody, more irritable. More regardless of the feelings of others, I suffered myself to use intemperate language to my wife. At length, I even offered her personal violence." Now, the tone is changing here. It's becoming more negative, concerned, even worried on the part of the author. And you can tell because these words, moody, irritable, regardless of the feelings of others, suffering, intemperate, those are all words with a negative connotation. Both word choice and imagery can affect tone in a piece. Here's another quote from the very same short story, The Black Cat by Edgar Allan Poe. "Beneath the pressure of torments such as these, the feeble remnant of the good within me succumbed. Evil thoughts became my sole intimates, the darkest and most evil of thoughts. The moodiness of my usual temper increased to hatred of all things and of all mankind, while from the sudden, frequent, and ungovernable outbursts of a fury." So here, Poe is appealing to the reader's senses and conveying a tone of struggle in this particular quote from the story. In addition to analyzing structure, archetypes, figurative language, and tone, the analysis of symbolism can greatly aid you in trying to critically analyze a piece of literature. So what makes symbolism distinct from, say, simile or metaphor? Well, a symbol typically encompasses both a literal meaning and a figurative meaning. Unlike a metaphor, a symbol is not necessarily a statement. A single word can evoke meaning and become a symbol. Being aware of common symbols in novels, any short stories, any fiction, will increase your ability to read the work critically. Here are some examples of symbols from this short story, A Black Cat by Edgar Allan Poe. First off, this penknife that the narrator carries around with him is symbolic of his imagined power over the cat. It is a knife that performs like a knife. He can cut with it, but it also symbolizes this power that the narrator thinks he has over the cat. There's also a white region on the breast of the cat, and though this is a patch in the cat's fur, literally, it symbolizes the purity in the cat's heart. And then finally, I'm skipping over a few of them, but you can look those over. There's a false chimney built into the basement where the narrator lives, and it's symbolic of the narrator's false sense of security. While it serves the purpose of being a false chimney, apparently to trick someone to thinking there's a chimney built there, it also is a symbol that represents this narrator's false sense of security. Every symbol must have both a literal and a symbolic meaning in the story to qualify to be a symbol. So the key to realizing that something is a symbol is that it must be present literally in the text. Something that a character could touch or move or see. And that literal something in the text must represent something other than its original literal meaning. The deeper and longer the reader ponders the text, the more symbols you are going to be able to uncover. They might even be symbols that the author never thought of. So the key to recognizing symbolism in fiction is realizing that a symbol must be present literally in the text. Something a character could see or feel or pick up. And that literal something in the text must represent something other than its literal meaning. The deeper and the longer a reader ponders in the text, the more symbols you are going to be able to uncover. They may even be symbols that the author had not considered because they're symbols that's based on your own background knowledge as a reader. So we've looked at structure, archetypes, figurative language, tone, and symbolism as components of a piece of literature that would help you critically analyze the piece as a whole. Let's now look at influences. There are many things that can influence an author in his or her writing of a piece of fiction. For every writer, some author's work appeals to him or her on some level, whether it's in the lessons learned, the style used, or the conclusions reached in the story. Try to discover who has influenced the author of the work you are trying to critically analyze. Consider the author's time in history, so looking at current events in that time. Other authors, whether they have been contemporary to that particular author or have come before them, and literary movements as well as influences from the author's personal life. Sometimes we are stuck just looking at the author's personal life as an influence, but there's really so much more to influences upon the author than just their own experiences. If you can trace an influence, your critical approach is going to be much more nuanced. That is, it will have more facets to it, more details, more different points of view brought to that critical analysis. Okay, and a quick note here, taking a look at influences on an author is going to require investigation outside the text itself. It will require you to do a little bit of research beyond just the text. Now, sometimes short stories in textbooks have a short little 2-3 paragraph introduction about an author, but it's usually pretty limited and often just limited to discussing the author's personal influences. Sometimes in a novel that's published, you can look at the back cover of the book or the inside flap of the jacket cover, or maybe even in an introduction or a dedication to get some idea of influences on the author. But if you're truly going to delve into this aspect of the critical analysis of a piece of literature, you will have to actually do some outside research. Here's an example of one influence on Edgar Allan Poe that I am sure influenced his writing of The Black Cat. Poe often wrote about the supernatural. His girlfriend, Sarah Whitman, was interested in spiritualism, which was a huge movement during the mid-19th century, and other metaphysical sciences that were popular in that time period. So here's an example from the story. The cat, especially the second cat that appears in the story, seems to have supernatural powers, and also the narrator does mention in the story that his wife was superstitious. So this is probably an outcome of the influence of the supernatural interest that Poe had during this time in history. And though it's not from The Black Cat, when I was researching influences on Poe, I found out that he got the idea for the shrinking chamber in his short story The Pit and the Pendulum from William Mudford's story The Iron Shrouds. Often authors are influenced by reading other authors' work. Here's another influence on Poe. The American Romanticism literary movement, which includes Romantic Gothic literature, began in about 1820, and most of Poe's works can be considered Romantic Gothic. Now, if you want to find out more about Romantic Gothic or American Romanticism, you may research that on your own. We don't have time for it in this video on critical analysis. Sometimes you can infer about influences on the author just by looking at details from the author's own personal life. Edgar Allan Poe was a proponent of slavery. Maybe, I'm thinking, that influenced his apparent disregard for human lives as shown in the story The Black Cat and many of the other short stories that Poe wrote. Also, the color red and blood appear in many of his stories. Perhaps this is because he saw so many of his loved ones coughing out blood before their own deaths. Many of them had the disease that was called consumption back during that time, and Poe was heavily influenced by that because so many people in his family, his loved ones, and other people that he knew had died of that. So we've seen how structure, archetypes, figurative language, tone, and symbolism, as well as influences on a particular author, can become part of a critical analysis of a piece of literature. I will link to these many resources I've used in preparation of this lesson in the description of the video down below so that you can check out these resources as well. I hope you found this lesson helpful. I know it's a little longer than the content I usually put up, but it's a more sophisticated topic, so it deserved a little bit more time. Please consider subscribing if you haven't already. Give us a thumbs up if you like the video, because we want you to never stop learning.